So our following panel is translating from and into Hebrew in the 20th century. We will have Erika Mejia and Judith Müller. And we will start with Erika Mejia, who holds a PhD in Hebrew literature from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing in Spanish Hebrew translation studies. Her dissertation examined Hebrew translations of Federico García Lorca poetry, focusing on methodologies and cross-cultural adaptation under the supervision of Professor Gidon Tikotsky and Professor Yoav Rinon. She also holds an MA in Spanish and Latin American Studies from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, with a thesis on Spanish Hebrew translation and idiomatic and phraseological adaptation. Erika Mejia has published on Spanish Hebrew translation, including Mediation and Political Calc, A Cry to Rome in Hebrew, and Linguistic Aspects of Spanish Hebrew Translation, a Phraseological Perspective. Erika, the topic of her presentation is Early Hebrew Translation of García Lorca between 1930 and 1950. Please, Erika, you are invited to start.
Thank you, Cynthia. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share my presentation. Can you all see my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me just arrange this. Okay, so what I'm going to share with you today is the argument for an article that I am writing based on one of the chapters of my PhD, which was focused on the Hebrew reception of the Spanish poet Federico García Lorca. And I'm going to walk you through the argument, and afterwards I would like to hear your thoughts, any thoughts. I am relying on several fields for my analysis, which I think is making it difficult to posit a clear argumentative claim. And additionally, I am working on textual analysis as well as on reception. And while these two are two sides of the same coin, I'm not sure how effective is the interweaving of the two in this specific article. So let's start. So this article focuses on Rafael Elias's 1958 Hebrew translation of García Lorca's Romancero Gitano. This was the first Hebrew translation of this collection. And my central claim is that Elias developed a systematic methodology that prioritized sound equivalence over other qualities of the text, and specifically over semantic fidelity. So this approach stands against the standardized translation conception of domestication versus foreignization with a more creative approach. And Elias implemented what I call here a parallel poetics, which was a recreation of the acoustic effects of the original through Hebrew-specific innovations. And additionally, he was working between two marginal literary traditions, Spanish and Hebrew, thinking here in Evansor terms of not at the center of any literary system or macro system. So as a first example, we can consider Elias' treatment of Lorca's verse, Verde que te quiero verde, Green, how I love you, Green, which is one of Lorca's most famous opening lines for the ballad. And this is a verse that the poet himself described as a hallucinatory sleepwalking verse that resists logical interpretation. So rather than translating literally, Elias exploited Hebrew morphology to match the concepts of greenness and dearness semantically and phonetically. And you have here what he did, Yakarta liyarok yakarta. You were dear to me, green, you were dear loosely. So he used two metathetic Hebrew roots that share consonants in different arrangements, and he matched greenness and dearness. And this is just one example of the principle that guided his translations, prioritizing the acoustic structure of the poems over a strict semantic correspondence. So So let's talk about the historical convergence. So the translation and also Elias's methodology are linked to the historical context. So on the one hand, there was a Spain, a few cycles after the Golden Age. It occupied a really diminished position in European cultural canon and was increasingly depicted as an exotic, semi-oriental space. And specifically within Hebrew literary culture of the 1950s, it was even classified as Oriental. And this created a certain contradiction for the reading public, for Spain held a great historical significance in Jewish memory, but at the same time, modern Spanish culture was largely unfamiliar to Hebrew readers at the time. And in this context, Elias's Bulgarian Sephardic background and its Judeo-Spanish linguistic heritage positioned him uniquely to navigate this convergence and to become a link between the two traditions. So we have here a picture of Leah Goldberg's and Reuven Levy's bibliography of translations into Hebrew up until 1951. And this was divided into national languages, but there was no Spanish category, and instead the Spanish works were included in this rather general category of Sifriyot HaMizrach or Oriental literatures. And then on the other hand, we have the Hebrew context, which was specifically the Yachdav poetics. So Hebrew literature, as we all know, was trying to acquire a certain European status by means of imitation, and was mostly dependent on European models for doing that. And in this context, the Yachdav group, to which Elias himself belonged, had imposed a signature style, which was called the Nusach, that defined poetry at the time, and it placed exceptional importance on what they conceived as musicality, which was the rhythm, verse, metrical patterns of the poems. And this was expressed mainly in tonic syllabic verse and rhyme. But at the same time, this group, while they were being extremely meticulous regarding the form of the poems and prioritizing this prosodic structure, their practice allowed considerable interpretive freedom when it gets to content. So this is the model that Elias would systematize in his Lorca translations. And then in this context, the Romancero was kind of a perfect match, because the Romancero Gitano contains 18 poems following the modern Spanish Romance form, which employs octosyllabic lines with assonance between even lines, which means they had a very strict and defined form. And at the same time, it was filled with modernist content, most significantly Gitano protagonists and Andalusian landscapes. So this was, according to J.B. Trent, poetry for the ear and not for the eye. And it was a meeting point for these two cultures, Spanish and Hebrew. So those are the three categories that I have identified in terms to mapping Elias's approach to the poems and his translation method. So first, there's the prosodic adaptation, converting Spanish rhythmic patterns, the octosyllabic lines, into Hebrew stress system. So Hebrew lacked at the time an established Romance paradigm, and I show how Elias went from an aleatory approach in his early translation to a more systematic one in the 1958 collection. And he used iambic tetrameters mostly, which is a kind of a 3-beat line. And he preserved a rhythmic asymmetry that mimicked the Spanish assonance. So you can see here one example, and then you can see how we have in the Spanish octosyllabic lines, and then he does the iambic tetrametric in Hebrew, which kind of mimics the Spanish. And Lorca has these 8 and 7 lines, which are asymmetric, and Elias mimics that, adding kind of a soft syllable at the end of the Hebrew sentences. The second category would be how Elias used interpretive mediation in order to bridge certain poetic effects. So again, the verde or green problem, one more time, exemplifies this approach. So in the poem Regerta, we have verde that operates simultaneously on a semantic and on an acoustic level. So you can see here that on the one hand, it carries the color verde, carries associations with death and supernatural in the traditional balladic tradition. But here it also establishes the poem's E assonance pattern that you can see on the Spanish. And then the literal Hebrew equivalent will be yarok, which would preserve the semantic equivalent more strictly. But instead, Elias chose to translate it as deshe, which is grass. And in this way, he maintains kind of a color association, but specifically he recreates the Spanish assonance in Hebrew with the e, and then which echoes with deshe, pere, nefesh, and albacete. And then the third category would be the lexical choices and how Elias preferred acoustic lexical substitutions instead of direct translations, but also borrowing from the source language. So again, to prioritize sound. So in Balada de la Luna Luna, rather than using the available Hebrew terms for moon, yareach, or sahar, levana, Elias just retained the Spanish luna, and this way, again, he preserved the ua assonance in Lorca's refrain. So we can see here, uje luna, 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 just became honusi luna, luna, luna. And all of these, of course, always carried internal meaning within the poem's structure, which means these sound patterns became part of the content. They were structural. And what I did for those examples is I chose the examples from poems of which there was a previous published version, either by Elias or by a different translator, to illustrate Elias's completed or more polished methodology. So Lorca began to be translated into Hebrew in 1938. And there were about 40 poems that were published very randomly in the Hebrew press until this collection was published in 1958. So about 40 poems, but only 4 of them were ballads from the Romancero, which I think attests to the difficulty of translating these ballads and also the lack of a model in Hebrew at the time. So I use these 4 translations that are previous to the collection to kind of try to understand what was possible to do at the time by contemporary translators and what Elias deliberately chose to do in his 58 translation. So about the critical reception, so the reception was basically mixed. And this is based on press clippings published at the time. And I think it reveals tensions that were latent at the time in Hebrew literary culture. So in 1959, Elias was awarded the Chernyakhovsky Prize, which is a translation prize. And he was awarded this for all of his translating work, but specifically it was noted his Lorca translation, the Romancero translation. And they added this kind of disclaimer in the judge's proceedings. So even if he occasionally sins in this or that line, he does not sin against the spirit of poetry. And this was the prize. And additionally, we have literary critics debating the publication on the press. So we have the older generation represented by A.B. Yaffe, who was aligned with the Yachtav poetics. And he praised Elias's achievement by saying that he captured rhythm and the atmosphere of the romances, but at the same time he questioned how we should evaluate poetry translation and whether literary accuracy should be the primary standard. And at the same time, he was wondering on how to assess translations, specifically in a language that he did not have access to, like many of the critics at the time. And then we have a younger generation that was admiring as well the technical achievement of Elias's translations, but they remained suspicious of what they saw as a kind of belle infidelité. So they were asking for transparency in translation. And then the most direct challenge came from Moshe Lazar, which was also a literary critic. And he published a really harsh critic, which was titled A Sparkling Translation or an Accurate Translation, in which he advocated for a precise yet poetic translation and opposed what he saw as the translator's personality intruding upon the original text in the case of Elias. And this is the end. This is Elias's defense. So he published a response, which was titled Faithful Criticism Also Sparkles, which is actually the only cohesive text he wrote about his translation poetics. And here he articulates a philosophy of recreation rather than plain reproduction. So he uses these two metaphors. The literal translation hits the target and kills the bird. The faithful translation captures the bird alive. And also kind of translation of as transformation and recreation. The translator must achieve this unity after breaking the original vessels and after kneading, mixing and blending the original material. So this was Elias's position, and I think he took the critic very hard and really tried to show how he was at the same time accurate in terms of semantic content, but also kind of recreating what Lorca did. Yeah, so these are broader topics that I'm thinking of to try to frame this whole discussion about maybe creative freedom and the connection with marginality. Also the translator as a cultural mediator, which is very clear in Elias's case. Questions about canon formation and innovation. So on the same year that Elias's Lorca translation was published, the first complete translation of Don Quixote also was published by Nathan Agmon or Nathan Bystrzycki. And there were some discussions on the press about whether Don Quixote should have gotten the prize and not Lorca. So this is also there. And then lastly, of course, kind of a discussion about what is faithfulness in translation and whether maybe a focus on sound can break up the usual dichotomy between form and content in this case. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika. We will pass the word now to Judith Müller, who will talk about female translators and the male canon, textual transfers from and into Hebrew. Judith Müller is a research associate at Goethe-University in Frankfurt and Main, and the coordinator of the Buber-Rosenzweig Institute. She is currently finalizing a book project on European Hebrew literature before and after the First World War that will see light next year. Other research projects deal with the reception of Hebrew literature among Jews in Germany in the 20s and 30s and questions of multilingualism in Jewish literature. Judith Müller completed her doctorate at the University of Basel and Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. From 2018 to 2022, she worked as research and teaching associate for Jewish literature at the Center for Jewish Studies in Basel. In 2024, she was Willy Brecher Fellow at the lab in Zurich. She published various research articles in journals and collected volumes on Hebrew literature and Weltliteratur. The authors David Vogel and Gershon Schofman, as well as the representation of Paris in Israeli literature. Please, Judith, the time is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Cynthia, and thank you also for the invitation. I will start right away. Okay, sorry. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. The asymmetry of gender roles in the translation industry often gives voice to canonical male writers through their female translators. Indeed, social norms and societal structures lead to a proportionally high number of women working in translation. In my current research, I am in particular interested in the gender gap in literary translation using the example of contemporary translation of Hebrew literature into German. In today's presentation, I will pick up the thread at an earlier point in time, though, in order to present to you female translators from the first half of the 20th century who translated from Hebrew to German, Margarete Tonowski-Piener, and from a variety of languages into Hebrew, Lea Goldberg. Both women approached translation from two different angles, which will become clearer in the following. It got stuck. Okay, I will get out for a second and then. Great. Both women approached translation from two different angles, which will become clearer in the following. Moreover, both translated at a time when the field was still dominated by male translators, as was literature in general. A brief introduction into the interrelation of Hebrew literature and gender, as well as Hebrew literature and translation, will give us a clearer picture. But before I come to those points, I like to briefly mention that I will indeed also briefly talk about contemporary translation and its gender gap before bringing my talk to a close. Women have been in the Jewish and non-Jewish literary sphere on their sidelines for decades. Sigrid Weigel, for example, argues with regard to the salon culture established by Rahel Varnhagen, among others, that these ladies acted rather as facilitators and were barely playing a role as authors in these circles. Weigel continues to argue that the literary imagination of the Jewess did not leave room for real-life Jewish women in literature, a situation that changed in the 20th century, but was often strongly connected to merging into the hegemonic culture. Turning to Hebrew is, however, the opposite of merging into the hegemony. It is strongly connected to a search for new or renewed Jewish identity, be it via Zionism or other national movements. Hebrew text culture has for a long time been dominated by male writers as well as readers. From rabbinic literature through the poetry of the Middle Ages to the Maskilic texts and the early days of the emerging modern Hebrew literature, Hebrew texts were written mostly by men for men. Exceptions might be letters to rabbis concerning women's topics, for example. Access to Hebrew text was granted through the traditional education system of cheder and yeshiva, a realm that women had almost no access to. To a certain extent, this factor had an impact on modern Hebrew literature at a time when many of the male writers already became rather secular. However, it is crucial to understand that at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, more and more women had indeed access to the Hebrew language. Alison Schechter demonstrates that women writers, quote, shaped new social, cultural, and literary experiments to reimagine the basis of Jewish culture beyond the traditionally male homosocial world of Jewish letters. Schechter thereby, quote, destabilizes the idea that Jewish literary modernity was a conversation among men about women, with a few women writers listening in while hiding behind the curtain, end of quote. Emerging female Hebrew writers had access to the language and its text culture mainly through either a religiously trained father who taught his sons and saw no reason why his daughters should not learn Hebrew. This was the case for Dvorah Baron, or through a Hebrew school system that was slowly opened to girls. This is how Lea Goldberg entered the world of Hebrew letters. While Baron and Goldberg are first and foremost known as writers of fiction and poetry in Hebrew, I would like to turn first to a different story, the one of the social worker and essayist Margarete Turnovsky-Piener, who, as it turns out, also translated from Hebrew into German for a very particular audience. Margarete Turnovsky-Piener was born in 1894. Her father was a board member of the Jewish community in Poznan and encouraged his daughter, like his sons, to continue her academic path towards the doctorate after completing her studies. During this time, the whole family moved to Berlin, where Margarete soon became active in the Jüdische Volksheim and undertook tasks in the Jüdische Arbeitsamt from 1919 onward. In line with the focus of her studies, she published primarily on social science issues in the Jüdische Rundschau, the Yediot Chadashot, the Forum, the Mitteilungsblatt des Irgun Olei Merkaz Europa, and the Viso-Schriften. From 1928 to 1930, she was involved in the public relations work of the Kulturverband Jüdischer Frauen für Palästina and subsequently managed Salman Schocken's Wohlfahrts- und Stipendienfonds until 1933. She lived in Jerusalem from 1925 to 1927 and finally emigrated to Palestine in 1933. In the lexicon on Jewish women in the 19th and 20th century, Bettina Kratz-Ritter attested to Margarete Turnovsky-Piener a, quote, Doppelfunktion als Fürsorgerin und Publizistin, a double function as caregiver and publicist. On October 10, 1934, the Journal of the Jüdische Frauenbund, League of Jewish Women in Germany, the Blätter des Jüdischen Frauenbundes für Frauenarbeit und Frauenbewegung, published a piece by Margarete Turnovsky-Piener wherein she discusses the children's songs by the acclaimed national poet Chaim Nachman Bialik. The article ends with 4 poems in German translated by Turnovsky-Piener herself. By introducing Bialik's poetry, the author claims, quote, da gab Bialik ihnen das hebräische Lied, machte die Sprache gefügig in Klang, Rhythmus und Reim. The English translation is on the slides. Education was on top of the agendas of Jewish women's organizations, whether they were Zionist or not. Even though the political questions were often an issue of division and disagreement as they defined each organization to its core, they had an impact on each other. Tamara Orr has shown that especially in German Zionism, the women were influenced by the general Zionist movement in the German-speaking countries. Consequently, Hebrew was not necessarily seen as the new national language, but as Orr continues to demonstrate, the Jüdische Nationale Frauenbewegung offered nevertheless Hebrew courses from 1903 onwards. For many female Jewish activists in Germany, this was their entry point to the Hebrew language. At the time of the publication of her piece, October 1933, Turnovsky-Piener had left Germany, and it can therefore also serve as an example of the continued exchange that the Blätter provided after 1933. Moreover, we can see her article along with her translation as an attempt to further educate Jewish women remaining in Germany about Hebrew literature and the quest for a reconnection with Judaism's authentic language. Turnovsky-Piener emphasizes the universal approach, as in her understanding these poems could be for all children, but, she writes, ein Lied ist angebunden an seine Sprache und darum an einen Raum. Bialik schrieb Hebräisch, so schrieb er für die Kinder Palästinas und den kleinen Kreis der hebräisch sprechenden jüdischen Kinder der übrigen Welt. Turnovsky-Piener addressed with her article the mothers of these children, or at least of the potential Hebrew-speaking Jewish children in the rest of the world, in Nazi Germany, where they lived under an increasing threat of persecution. Her text can therefore also be understood as a call not only to teach these children Hebrew, but to let them join the other Hebrew-speaking children and become children of Palestine, in order for them to have a childhood as it is echoed in Bialik's poems. With her article on Bialik's children's poems and the translations, Margarete Tornowski-Piener took on the role of both publicist and activist within the Jüdische Frauenbund, but also catered to the role of the mother and its cruciality within Jewish women's self-fulfillment through raising their children as it was promoted by the Frauenbund. Through the translation, Tornowski-Piener empowered Jewish women remaining with their family in Nazi Germany to familiarize their children with Bialik without even knowing the language themselves. She, moreover, introduces the poet and emphasizes the importance of Hebrew knowledge, however, not necessarily for the women themselves, rather she first and foremost encourages her fellow Frauenbund members to provide their children with a new mother tongue, as she enthusiastically reports from her new homeland. Bei den Kindern Palästinas war das Hebräische wieder zur Muttersprache, zu dem naturgemäßen Ausdruck ihres Erlebens geworden. Against the backdrop of a growing Hebrew reading audience at the time, a steadily growing demand for world literature in Hebrew translation can be identified. It is thus hardly surprising that from the end of the 19th century on until well into the 1960s, many Hebrew writers, particularly poets, acted as translators alongside the production of new Hebrew texts. This required a deep knowledge of European literature and at least and this was the case for many, multilingualism. One of these translators was Lea Goldberg, whom I would like to introduce to you here. Lea Goldberg was born in Kovno in today's Lithuania in 1911. At the age of 10, she wrote in her Hebrew diary that she wanted to become a Hebrew writer, a path she pursued vigorously and successfully. In addition to Hebrew, Goldberg spoke Russian, her mother tongue, and grew up as the daughter of a Yiddishist. In 1930, she went to Berlin to study Semitic languages, eventually completing her doctorate in Bonn. She also added Italian, English, and French to her knowledge of German. Equipped with this repertoire of languages, Goldberg was able to translate a wide range of world literature into Hebrew. She translated Dostoevsky and Tolstoy from Russian, Petrarch and Dante from Italian, Rilke from German, Baudelaire from French, and Shakespeare from English. Goldberg, therefore, is also an outstanding example for the interrelation of multilingualism and translation. Moreover, she translated mostly male writers, thus mirroring the contemporary situation in the translation of Hebrew literature into German. While translation has been dominated by male scholars for a rather long time, and this is the case for the translation from and into Hebrew as well, some translations aimed in particular at women, for example, of the Bible in the vernacular. Tornowski-Piener and Goldberg lived at a time when still the majority of translators were male. This changed, and with regard to Hebrew, but not only, it led to women translated a male-dominated canon. I would therefore like to end my presentation with this display visualizing this circumstance. You see the portraits of the late Miriam Pressler, along with Ruth Achlammer, Anne Birkenhauer, and Gundula Schiffer, and a few examples of the authors that they translate and translated. While this does not mean that they do not translate works by female authors, Birkenhauer translates, for example, Zruja Shalev, and Schiffer put one of Goldberg's novels into German, or that there are no male translators, Markus Lemke is the best known for Hebrew into German today, it nevertheless visualizes a gender gap that I am currently trying to understand more thoroughly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Judith. So we have enough time for questions. So you can raise your hands or write me in the chat if you want to start. I will start. I have a question for Erika regarding Lorca, Romancero Gitano. Are they other translations that I imagine that came much after, even during the 21st century? And in that case, if you could make like general comparatives of why we needed a new translation and what are the differences?
So I think after Elias, when he stopped translating Lorca, there was like maybe a 20-year period where you focused on his more modernist works that were also not translated yet into Hebrew. And then the first translation of the Romancero was by Rina Litvin in, I think it was 2002, which was not a complete translation. She translated a selection of romances. And then there was another complete translation by Rami Saari in 2019. And recently, last year, there's also an anthology of translations by Tal Nitzan, and she also included a selection of some ballads. So in terms of the complete collection, we only have two, which is Elias's and Rami Saari. You were asking about this phenomenon of retranslation, which I think it's very interesting. I don't have an answer. I have some guesses. So I think Elias's poetics, and not only his poetics, the Yachdav poetics were at a moment of crisis when he was translating, and they kind of went down and were replaced by Nathan Zach and the new generation that were aiming for a more straightforward poetics, less tonic syllabic structures, a more loose prosody, and also a more maybe simple vocabulary. So I think his translations felt updated very quickly. And then Rina Litvi and also Rami Saari, when they translate, they are translating already from a completely different point of view in terms of the translator in what to prioritize. And this is very, you can really feel it in terms of what Elias prioritized and what Litvin and Saari saw as more important. I think it's the most striking thing is that they really prioritize content in a very modern way, as how you have to respect what's there in the poem in terms of content and form as more of a secondary aspect. And I think Elias's approach was the opposite of that.
Would you say that there was a big influence from Elias regarding Hebrew literature in general? I mean,
so
this perspective of acoustic translation would have an influence on the way Hebrew writers would think of poetry?
So this is a question that came up a lot, I think, when I was writing my dissertation. I don't think so. I don't think he had a huge effect, not in his immediate generation and not afterwards. There has been kind of a return to that generation now with the translational turn, and also with Dori Manor and this group going back to more structured prosodic structures in poetry. So I think they are going back to Elias's and other people from that generation writings. but I don't think. I will be happy to hear if somebody can think of like an effect that Elias had in Hebrew literature. I did not find anything specific. And I also think, well, yeah, the crisis between these generations really make him disappeared quickly in history, and also he stopped translating Lorca for quite a few years after the Romancero, so he kind of got swallowed up in the flow. That's what I think.
Thank you. Yes, Shiri, please go on.
I was trying to find a common thread in both presentations, and maybe I'm distorting or committing a sin, as Erika quoted the reception of Elias's translation. But I think the interesting common thread was how the translation of Bialik and the translation of Lorca each focus on a very specific quality of the source. So with Lorca, that would be, of course, the acoustic aspect, very literally the acoustic aspect, not even the spirit of it, but as you have shown, sometimes even very specific acoustic threads in the original poem. And for the Bialik translation, I would say that it's not always very committed to the text itself, which is very interesting. I mean, it had an educational purpose, but it doesn't seem, or correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't seem as if you want to educate, the translator wanted to educate the readers regarding the content or the specific poetry, but about the fact that there are now children speaking Hebrew. This is happening, and it also produces poetry in a way. So I'm just throwing that out, not as a question, but if you have more to elaborate, I would be very happy to hear more.
Erika, do you want to start or should I?
You can start.
Okay. Yes, so you're exactly right, Shiri. I think this is the point that you're making is exactly it, because I mean she uses those poems and her translation not so much in order to transfer a message that Bialik might have had to a German reading audience, but rather to transfer her own message and use it as an invitation. I mean, only the fact that she translates it into German and then also offers an interpretation, which is not really an interpretation, but rather an elaboration of the current situation and an encouragement to start learning Hebrew. She really focuses more. I think the main focus is on her text rather than the actual poems themselves. Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
So I would like just to add just a fact that also links both presentation, and is that Goldberg was actually the first translator of Lorca into Hebrew, one of the first translators of Lorca into Hebrew. So she translated in 1946 one of the theater plays. But at the time, apparently, she didn't really know Spanish or either Italian yet. So she used a secondary text. But I think the motivation was mainly political at that time, specifically for that translation.
And just as a follow-up question, can you see this motivation in the text, in the translated text, or do you just know this from the background?
Well, I know just specifically for the context of publication, it was 10 years from the Civil War. There were like a lot of items in the press emphasizing this context, and in the framework of Lorca's assassination, and the whole context was like very socialist and anti-fascist. In the text itself, I did not check that. I know it's very edited, it's very loose, it's a very loose translation, but it was kind of normal at the time.
Super interesting, thank you.
Thank you. Golda, you have a question?
Yes, thank you for the wonderful presentations. And I think a little bit following the question that she made about also, and Erika was answering, of this political intentions with these translations. I'm curious to know if also in these translations they had a willingness to modernize or implement new styles or new words into the Hebrew language. Usually translations eventually do that, but I'm thinking, for example, the translations into Yiddish, Gladstein would adapt the fusion terms of James Joyce, for example, so adapting new style, new words, in modernizing the Yiddish language. And I don't know if there was this willingness in these Hebrew translators in actually adding a new style, new words, new vocabulary into the Hebrew language. Thank you.
So you were thinking also in Elias's translation?
Yes, when you say especially with the rhythm of the words, did he actually, in order to do that, he probably had to adapt some Hebrew words, or not invent, but modernize? And was there willingness to do that, or there was actually just a political agenda behind it?
So I think he used less neologisms than maybe other writers were more prone to invent words, but he did went a lot to the biblical terms and kind of archaic expressions that even at the time were not in use that much. But he kind of moved freely between the more modern Hebrew and maybe the more biblical sources, which I think added to the updatedness of his translations. And this is also, of course, related to his background. He emigrated to Israel fairly late. He was born in 1905, and he emigrated in 1923. And he kind of learned Hebrew there from scratch because he didn't had a Jewish education in Sofia, in Bulgaria, where he was born. So I think this gave him kind of a distance where he could play with the registers a bit more maybe than others at the time. But otherwise than that, he was very obedient to the Yardav's Nosach. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Judith, would you talk about, is there a place to talk about a gendered translation coming from these women translators, or would they play the transparent translators of the men's canon?
So for contemporary Hebrew, it's very diverse. There is, of course, when it comes to translation, there's a lot of, I would almost say, political influence, especially when it comes to translating from Hebrew into German. There's a specific expectancy that the German audience has, and a specific interest. So a German audience is mostly interested in everything connected to the Holocaust and everything connected to the Middle Eastern context, conflict, and everything beyond is very hard to sell. I, in particular, focused in my research on the translation of pre-World War Hebrew literature into German today, which is very, I mean, Europeans in general are rather unaware, if they are not connected to Jewish literatures like us, and that Hebrew literature existed in Europe, or especially emerged in Europe before the Second World War. And it's very difficult to translators to convince publishers to go through with translating such a work. I mean, Gundula Schiffer, for example, translated Lea Goldberg's Avruj, and this is because she, as a translator, won a stipend, a fellowship that gave her the opportunity to sit in quiet for 1 or 1.5 years and to simply work on that novel, which is a certain luxury, I guess, when you are translating. And Gundula Schiffer in particular really tried for a long time to convince publishers of the importance and also the interesting aspects that modern Hebrew literature written before the Second World War brings into the discourse. But it's very, very difficult to convey that. And the situation in the US is, for example, kind of the opposite, because I mean, now there's not that much translation anymore happening, but for a long time, translations into English from Hebrew literature actually were produced in order for academia to have a certain basic to teach modern Hebrew literature at American universities. And this opened a door throughout some decades at least to really widely translate those writers. But yeah, so Gundula Schiffer has that focus, and she also really tries to here comes the gender aspect again. She really focuses on female, also poets. She herself is a poet, a bilingual poet. She writes in German and in Hebrew and translates herself. And Ruth Achlama has a specific translated Schoffmann and Vogel. So again, those are male writers. And for Bressler and Anne Birkenhauer, it's rather hard to see the gender aspect. I mean, it's in particular Gundula Schiffer who really thinks that it is important to convey female writers to a German audience.
Okay, thank you. If we do not have any more questions, we will close the morning, as many people are waking up now, and I hope they will join us later. So for us, it will be lunch break, and for them, it's little breakfast. So bon appetit, and I hope to see you in 1 hour. Thank you.